Good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome. Hello, thanks for joining us. I'm making a prompt start because we've got a lot to pack into the next 2 hours, but it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of this first State of Natural Capital report, noting the really important second part of the title, Risks to Nature and Why It Matters. My name's Sally Bailey. I'm the Chief Scientist for Natural England, and I'd like to welcome you all in the room and actually the 800 plus people that are watching and listening online. So we've got a busy agenda. I'll be keeping people to time, and we'll start with the keynote speeches, and then we'll hear from Tony, Ruth, Marion, and then we'll have really useful responses to those to the report as well, and then the Q&A panel. Now, the purpose of these discussions is really for us to share the report. It's brought together the best evidence that we have on the state of England's natural capital and provides a new method to understand the risk to our natural capital. And by focusing on those drivers of risk, it provides also solutions and actions to clarify for policy beyond our usual policy audience, I would say, that tends to be with DEFRA and our other arm's length bodies, but those areas of policy and business and finance that need to actually sit up and listen to the decisions that we need to all take for our future in terms of protecting the natural capital that will in turn protect us and our future generations. So the report itself has been put together by our excellent team in natural capital, and it's a culmination of over 2 years' work. I'm going to ask the team now just to put their hands up so you can see who they are. And you will also see that all speakers and the team have burgundy underbars on their labels. So please, when we have lunch, talk to them more about the report. And what we are really interested in doing is looking at how we develop impact for this report with your help in terms of that engagement plan going forwards. So start to think about that as well, and we can have some productive discussions over lunch about really getting this report to have the impact it so richly deserves. So the work enables decision makers beyond our usual scope to understand the value of nature and the need to protect and invest in our natural assets that underpin society on which we, and as I say, the future generations depend. Essentially, the report will make the invisible visible and the undervalued visible, and therefore should be part of all of our collective decision making and policy going forwards. Oh, crumbs. Sorry, guys. Can someone move the next slide on? So what it does is it presents all the evidence for decision makers and brings it all into one place. It presents a comprehensive assessment of the state of our ecosystem assets in England, why they're important and what is impacting on them. It assesses the risks to natural capital and the benefits that they provide, why nature is at risk, and what this means for those services which we rely on. And it interprets this risk into 5 key policy areas, including economic resilience, net zero, climate adaptation, food security, health and well-being, and water security. So that is broadening it out to those critical assets for humanity. And then finally, it identifies priority actions and opportunities to mitigate the risks on these assets and what we can all do about it. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to hand over to Tony Juniper, OBE, our chair, who will provide some next remarks. And
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to risk putting paper on the screen. We'll see what happens. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us here today for the launch of what we regard at Natural England as really quite an important piece of work. And thank you all to the Natural England team who brought this work together, and indeed the very many researchers with whom they've collaborated, who collected much of the data which we've been able to summarise today. Now, this notion of natural capital, I think, is really quite a powerful idea. I think everybody in the room will understand the notion of financial capital and how, if we look after our capital assets, we get a flow of dividends and interest long into the future. And of course, if we blow our capital, we go bankrupt. And so it goes with natural capital, and the extent today, and confirmed by this report, just how deeply into the red we have drifted over the years. And this is now something which poses a source of risk. And the state of natural capital very much confirms the need to grow nature as a prerequisite for health, wealth and security. Indeed, with economic growth identified as an overriding national priority, it will be necessary to grow the natural assets needed to underpin that. The report gives a clear snapshot of the state of these assets, gives us a logical baseline from which to measure growth over time. It highlights the extent to which we rely on nature, which gives us life's essentials of fresh water, air and food. In fact, with 90% of the world's food reliant on just 20 species, we ignore this at our peril. Nature also provides places to relax, resources to build with, and mitigation of the climate change impacts ever more visible on the planet. In short, if we look after nature, nature will look after us. But the truth is, and exposed in this report, that we haven't been. The web of life is in critical decline. 90% of the UK's wetlands have been lost in the modern era, and over 97% of lowland semi-natural grasslands. In the last century, taking with them countless birds, butterflies and bumblebees. Nature is being wiped off the face of our supposedly green and pleasant land. But we continue to act as if we were oblivious to the warning signs from a planet that is evidently struggling. Impacts like these exacerbate many of the most serious threats to society. Nature loss and climate change fuel one another, so losing wildlife and habitat helps drive changes to weather systems to unprecedented extremes, which in turn forces more species to flee their traditional ranges and for some to be wiped out altogether. For years, we have taken nature for granted and taken more than it can sustainably supply. We are in effect running down those capital assets as we strip away nature's ability to provide clean water and carbon storage by degrading soils, which increases water pollution and sends harmful emissions into the atmosphere, affecting human health and adding to consumer bills. Those degraded soils and lost wetlands reduce landscape's ability to regulate temperature, hold water and to slow the flow of rivers, amplifying flooding downstream. And not only does this cause widespread human misery, it puts businesses and services out of action and adds considerably to insurance premiums. And it's very interesting to note in the wake of Hurricane Helene, which smashed through the southern states of the United States a couple of weeks ago, how many of the properties there were uninsured because they were not deemed to be in areas prone to flood risk, thereby revealing a series of not only serious economic consequences, but also social ones. And the costs of degradation can be measured not only economically, but in the lives lost. For example, almost 3,000 excess deaths occurred across the UK in 2022 as a result of that extreme heat, and also seen in the impacts on agriculture, with flooding causing losses to farming income in England to drop by a fifth in 2023, leading to a £1 billion blow to this country's GDP. The decline of nature is not only visible in the countryside, of course, but also in our towns and cities and villages, particularly amongst the most disadvantaged communities. Evidence gathered in the State of Natural Capital report indicates that lower risks of stick days are associated with increased access to green and blue spaces. However, according to Natural England's green infrastructure research, we see that more than 1 in 3 people, 38%, do not live within 15 minutes of a green space, and they tend to be from more disadvantaged communities. The link between social inequalities and differences in health outcomes is thus strong and persistent. The upside of all of this, of this disturbing picture, is that we can work together across society to recover nature and unlock solutions to these pressing challenges. And for that to happen, information regarding the value we all derive from nature is needed to be put into the hands of those who decide on actions that shape our country at both national and local levels. And that's where this research comes in. It gives decision makers a vivid picture of these close dependencies between social well-being and economic resilience and the ecosystems which underpin those essentials of our society. And taking a natural capital approach highlights the extent to which our mountains, wetlands, seabeds, soils and rivers are just as critical to business success and community well-being as roads, railways and broadband. And these natural assets add up to a national wealth service, providing a steady stream of essential goods and benefits upon which our economy and population rely. Setting them out so clearly as we're doing today allows them to be moved out of the shadows and onto an extended balance sheet where companies can see their true value and act to protect these priceless and essential assets. This allows us to progress beyond just seeing the health of our economy and country in terms of GDP and to incorporate the health of our natural capital and its ability to sustain our economy into our understanding of the condition of our nation. It's time we treasured this National Wealth Service as much as we do the National Health Service. And what I hope people will understand as a result of this State of Natural Capital report is that nature isn't some rather quaint, distant notion that inevitably gets trampled by progress or occasionally holds it up, but nature is a dynamic, vigorous, multi-layered force that can provide so many of our essential needs today and into the future if we take this opportunity to understand it better and to treat it with respect. And for these reasons, a thriving natural world means nature flourishing across landscapes, hills, valleys, towns and cities, seas and shores where people can be active, inspired and fulfilled. Healthy rivers and wetlands providing clean water and homes for wildlife and reducing the risks of flooding and drought. Restored peatlands and seabeds storing vast quantities of carbon instead of releasing it into the atmosphere. Trees, shrubs, parks and rivers cooling cities in summer, bringing urban dwellers closer to nature, reducing crime and encouraging businesses to invest. Hedgerows and flower-rich margins, ensuring a plentiful supply of pollinators for crops, underpinning food security. And all of these benefits provide us with security and resilience in an uncertain world. Put them together, and it's very clear that nature isn't different to growth. It is at the heart of it. You cannot grow the economy if you don't grow nature. And according to recent estimates, the value of the UK's stock of natural capital assets is just over £1.5 trillion. Is it wise to blow that capital and to not think about tomorrow? Or should we try to grow that capital to thereby grow the dividends and interest that we will get into the future? And the evidence presented in this report reveals the answer and how investing in nature recovery pays the upfront costs many times over. However, each decade doubles the costs of restoring the damage, meaning that the longer we leave this process of nature recovery, the more expensive it will become. This report thereby offers an important resource for policymakers, making the invisible visible and providing the missing evidence needed, guiding the action that we require to achieve sustainable use of our natural assets. The case for nature recovery as a result of this work makes it an even stronger agenda, and I encourage those of you here today not to read the report only and to be informed by it, but to use it in your future decision-making processes and to create a stronger positive outlook for our economy and society by doing so. Thank you all very much for being here today. Very much looking forward to conversations during the course of the morning, and I hope you do find this report of interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I'd now like to introduce Ruth Waters, who's our Head of Evidence. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sally, and it's absolutely brilliant to see so many friends who've been on this journey with me today and with the team. So businesses, the economy, society and individuals, we all depend on nature and the benefits it provides. But as we've discussed earlier, often we don't realise those dependencies, and so consequently it's missing in decisions or it's invisible. And, you know, nature is one of the most amazing renewable resources that we have. When it's in good working order, when it's got the full complement of biodiversity, it's more productive. It provides us with more of the benefits that we rely on. And it's also more resilient and adaptable to change. And we know there's a lot of change going on at the moment. But also, I think that what we're really trying to do here, as Tony said, is make the invisible visible, make the information available for a much broader range of decision makers than we have done in the past. And so the State of Natural Capital report in England is really trying to do that. And it does it by looking at the state of our ecosystems, what are they doing at the moment, what are the risks to those ecosystems and the benefits that they're providing, what are those implications therefore for a broad range of policy areas, but importantly, how do we need to act and mitigate and fix those risks? So within this report, we have used the best available evidence on the quantity and quality of our ecosystems, because this tells us about whether they're able to continue to provide us with the benefits. And we've used data from all sorts of sources, anything from citizen science data, where volunteers have gone out and collected information on all sorts of things like birds, bats and butterflies, information from the government. We've used indicators for the Environmental Improvement Plan. We've used information from many of our partnership organisations, like the Forestry Commission and the Environment Agency. And also we're drawing on new information from the Natural Capital Ecosystem Assessment, which is a DEFRA group programme collecting information on the quantity and quality of natural capital and the services it provides in England. And this is an ongoing programme, but we've been able to draw some of the data. So on this slide, you can see the Live in England map, which shows a habitat probability map of England with the extent of habitats that we currently have. So this has been a really, really useful tool. And it builds this work on years of work on natural capital within Natural England, but also years of working in partnership with many people here and I'm sure online as well. So I want to say a big thank you to the team, but to all of you that have been on the journey with us to get us to this point. And I really look forward to continue to work with all of you in the future. So how have we done this report? Well, what we've done is we've looked at 8 broad ecosystem types, and then we've looked at what state they're in through quantity and quality, and then we've looked at how the 5 key drivers of change on nature impact on them. And so these drivers of change are land and sea use change, the impacts of pollution, the impacts of resource extraction from them, how it responds to climate change and the impact of invasive alien species. And we've looked at these broad habitat types, both in the journey they've come from to be in the state they're in now, but also how we're expecting those drivers to impact on them in the future too. And then we've used a lens of 6 key policy areas that are particularly reliant on nature to then draw out some of these risks for us. And so we've included economic resilience, net zero and our ability to be able to achieve our net zero targets, our response to climate change adaptation, our food security, our water security, and of course our health and well-being, which is another critical area. So what are some of the key findings that we have? Well, what we found is degraded ecosystems are much less able to cope with future change. So, you know, really, that's really important. We know that we're in a difficult position. And if you look at this table on the slide, this describes the impact and trends of drivers of change to the 8 ecosystem types using the most recent information. And what it shows us is that those impacts are increasing and they're becoming more severe. And this rapid increase in the severity of impacts really puts those benefits at risk. All our ecosystems and almost all of our benefits are at high or medium-high risk, so we're actually in quite a poor state. So that includes marine, coastal margins, freshwater and wetlands, woodlands, mountains, moorlands and heath are all at high risk. Now, this could really undermine and actually be unhelpful in the success of our broad policy delivery because of the current poor states of our assets. And I think it's that connection that we really want to get to through this report. So what are some of the implications for policy areas? Well, in this table, you can see the 6 broad policy areas we talked about at the top, and down the sides there are a range of benefits that we get from them. And every single policy area has at least 3 red high-risk areas, and most of them it's many more. So if I try to describe that in a little bit more detail to give you a bit of some examples of that, for food security, we know that soil erosion and actually compaction and loss of organic matter really impacts on our ability to grow crops and to support livestock. And already across England and Wales, these issues are causing us 1.2 billion a year, and we're expecting those risks to get much worse. In the marine environment, there's lots of pressures, particularly on the seabed, which is putting fisheries, our net zero target, and human health and well-being at risk. And actually in the English Channel and the South Celtic Sea, these impacts on the seabed are expected to cover 75% of that area. So again, we're expecting those risks to increase and get worse for us. Another example actually is invasive alien species. There's been predicted that the impacts of invasive alien species and potential diseases that come to them could have £1.8 billion worth of loss across crops, agriculture, timber and forestry if we don't manage to stem the flow of some of those things. And finally, for our health and well-being, we know that access to nature for adults and children is particularly important for our physical and mental health. And our recent Children, People and Nature survey has shown that 88% of children actually report being happy in nature. So it's a fantastic resource for them. But also land use change and land degradation means that we're way below the target that government has for having green space on our doorstep. So again, putting that happiness for our children at risk and that health and well-being for people more broadly. So it does feel like we're carrying an awful lot of risk across an awful lot of sectors. But as I said earlier, nature is an amazing renewable resource. And there's an awful lot we can do about this and do about it really quickly. And so what I want to do now is hand over to Marion, who's going to describe some of these opportunities we can do to turn this around so we can have a long-term relationship with nature that's resilient and provides us with the benefits we want and supports our economy and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you. Have we cracked the slides? I will juggle as best I can. Thank you. So thank you, Ruth and Tony. So Tony's explained to you why it matters. Thank you. So thank you, Ruth and Tony. So Tony's explained to you why it matters. Ruth explained what matters. My job is to do the so what and tell you how we think we should now be reacting to this. And I think the first key message is we do need to act now. And I'm not just saying that because that's what everybody does, doesn't it? Everybody says their issue is the important one and we all need to act. I think the slide gives you 3 reasons why we need to act now, but just to amplify that a little bit. Many of us are familiar with the Stern and the Dusk Up to Economics and that economic message that spending money now avoids further costs in the future, better value for spending quicker. But I think there's more to it when we're thinking about investment in nature. There's something about those benefits that Ruth was describing a moment ago. The longer we leave it to act, the more we don't gain those benefits and the more we have disbenefits. So if we have another generation of children and adults growing up without adequate access to nature, we are more likely to see a growing incidence of long-term physical and mental health conditions like diabetes, low-level depression, and so on. So there's something about why would we wait to realise those benefits and why we would continue to store up problems. And we're also, of course, starting to see ecosystems creaking, if not breaking, in the UK and overseas. You know, the storms we've seen in England, the flooding we're now seeing on farmland. This is now a real and present problem, not a future theoretical problem. I think there's also a very practical reason for investing and acting on nature now, as we need to grow our economy and as we particularly have an imperative to improve and speed up the way we, for example, make decisions through planning on housing. I will hold our hands up here. Some of the decisions Natural England has had to make over the last year on issues like nutrient neutrality, not being able to give planning permission for housing until we have resolved nature problems. If we move to a system where we invest up front and we build more resilient catchments, we've then created that resilience, created that headroom that means we don't have to wait to allow capital investments such as housing growth. So there's a big imperative for acting quickly. The other thing I wanted to say, just as a general comment, that I hope has come through, but sometimes I feel I have to remind people of this or make clear that when Natural England is talking about acting on nature, we're not just talking about Natural England's specific interests. We're not talking about nature reserves or wildlife. Nature is an ecosystem. As I heard somebody from the Eden Project put it quite succinctly, nature is our planet. So the actions we're talking about in this report aren't just the things you might traditionally have heard Natural England talk about. It is about looking after the ecosystems that we all depend on. So I think the other thing I wanted to just remind us all about, again, the benefits of acting on nature are because they are going to help, they are central to our government's 5 missions. I suspect most of you are as familiar with the missions as I am by now. But just to sort of illustrate a little bit, that point I just made about kickstarting economic growth, if we want to make sure we have the resilience in our ecosystems to accept and adapt to the pressures that physical growth, be that housing, infrastructure, roads, energy, that idea that if we get the mitigation in up front, if we act at scale, we've built the resilience in so the growth flows without negative impact. Equally, with our energy superpower, taking offshore wind as a central plank of that, the quicker, the better decisions we make about siting our offshore wind, as well as how it is then constructed and the mitigation we put in place. If we get that spatial planning and that spatial prioritisation right, we can move more quickly to having wind farms in the places where they will provide what we want. I think that rather neat phrase of we want low carbon, high nature, and also social justice, social transition. There's something about having nature right in the first place. Tony touched on this, the Take Back Our Streets mission, having safer, happier communities. Nature has a part to play in that. We know the more green space we have, the more people are out in their communities. A phrase I've learnt recently, there's sort of almost this passive surveillance. It's quite an ugly phrase, but it simply means the more that people are out and about because they're happy and confident, because they're in safe, welcoming green spaces, the less we see antisocial behaviour and low-level crime. And the barriers to opportunities. I did a visit a few years ago at the beginning of our Children and Nature programme, which was helping children have access to green space during the school day, either within their school grounds or, for many urban schools, an opportunity to just spend a short time in nature. The teachers told me, what was then evidenced by the evaluation, that the children are more likely to attend school, but even more importantly, when they're in the classroom, they are more likely to be attentive and therefore their attainment grows up. Ruth touched on this idea of nature being good for children. I also heard what sounds like a quite frightening study, actually, recently done by the American National Parks Association bodies, where they literally wired children up to heart monitors and brain whatever. Goodness knows how the poor children then did relax in nature, but they had those physical indicators that even a short time in nature reduced those children's stress levels. So slightly frightening experiment, but one in which the evidence holds true. And of course, again, we've touched on this already. The sooner people have better access to nature, the sooner we can start to tackle that health mission of avoiding and having cost-effective therapies for many of our health and social problems. So we know it works, and the report tells us the priority actions. Again, many of these will be familiar to many of you in this room. It is about restoring our ecosystems. That involves making new habitats, but it also involves helping the habitats and the ecosystems we've already got become more resilient, provide their functions. And some of that is about reducing the impacts of change. And that might be pollution, it might be chemicals, it might be pesticides, it might be physical modifications that we've made to many of our natural systems. So there's something about restoring and reducing future pressure. But I think probably the one on there that you're going to hear most about today, and in the conversations we hope will follow from today's events, it's about making the right decisions, putting nature in front of us, talking about what nature means. The other thing that strikes me looking at this slide, and I hope you can read them on the screen, if not, they're obviously in the document. We know how to do all of this stuff. Technically, we know how to do it. We have the means, we have the technology. Isn't that a spot quote? We have the technology to do this. The hard part is making the decision to do it, to understand the need. And the hard part, particularly for those of us, especially those of us in the public sector, but actually even those in business and civil society, it's then deciding the right means to achieve it. You know, do we need a new form of regulation? Do we need a new financial incentive? Do we need to be working on behaviour change? So we know how to do this. We have to commit to doing it, and then we have to think through the most effective and the most cost-effective way to drive that change. So I'm just going to unpack a few of those actions. And I'm not going to talk through all of them because they're there, and again, they'll be familiar to many of you. But that point about carbon capture, restoring peatlands, restoring seagrass, restoring woodlands, growing our woodland and tree cover, we rely on nature at the moment to remove 50 megatons of carbon to meet our net zero target. We should be doing a lot more than that. There is something about really investing in nature-based solutions to climate change. And there's also a big focus in the report, and a second on that slide, about helping our farm businesses transition to a more nature-friendly version of farming, which for many of them is good for business resilience, but is also good for food security. So this idea that if we have healthier soils, if we have better soil health, we are less likely to lose soil, which, let's be frank, for many of our farmers is their most important working capital. So at the moment, we see soil degradation, erosion and compaction is losing 1.2 billion a year in the farm economy. So there's real economic imperatives for acting on more nature-friendly farming. And I think the other thing that's hidden in that nature-friendly word is climate resilient farming. We've seen over the last year, and the farmers will suffer and we will suffer increasingly, this incident of flooding. You know, we have farmland now that is not resilient to flooding, and we need to start to think about how do we adapt to that and how do we invest in nature to make those farms resilient to flooding. There's plenty of marine action as well. Looking after our seabeds, again, there's something in there. I've already mentioned seagrass planting and restoring seagrass will help make our seabeds more climate resilient. We know that they can absorb, gosh, this is quite a frightening range, but our seabed, if managed well, has a value in climate, in carbon dioxide sequestration of between 700 million and 4 billion. So there's a big range there. We don't yet know enough about it, but it's pretty powerful how much carbon we can potentially capture. There's also something for me in here. I meant to make the point earlier that when we're talking about acting now, we're not just talking about spending money. Some of this is just about making the right decision, not necessarily spending. For our seabeds, it is where we site offshore wind will make as big a difference as how we site it. So that top picture, there's a marl bed in there somewhere. That is our irreplaceable habitat. Don't have your fishing impact in your offshore wind where you've got irreplaceable habitat. And finally, our towns and cities. And again, just in case anybody is in any doubt about this, nature is not just a countryside issue or a seaside issue, it is also an urban issue. So this investing in multifunctional nature-rich towns and cities, that new development benefiting communities, this isn't just about nature because it's nice for people to have in cities. Having the right type of vegetation in our cities will help with air pollution, as an example. So vegetation absorbs, there's the potential for vegetation to absorb fine particulate air pollution. And air pollution is currently accounting for 6 million sick days in Britain every year. So nature will solve some of those issues as well. And also more climate resilience in our towns, more trees being planted and more shade. Urban cooling will help reduce energy usage on air conditioning to deal with the growing impacts of climate change. So what next? There is a challenge for us. There is that need to act. As I've already said, we know what to do. We don't even necessarily need to spend money or more money. We need to make the right choices about the money we're spending, and we need to make the right choices about policies, about planning, about how we do the fine detail of things. So what we hope that this report will do for all of us, whether we work in government, whether we work in businesses, or whether we work in civil society in the third sector, we hope that this report will inform decisions about investment strategies, about risk management, reactions, about policy development. We'd like you to talk to us today and as we go forward as to how will this report help you. This, as Sally always said, is the first report. We intend to repeat this and we tend to refine it. So we'd like to know what works for you. And I think I'm going to leave you with two thoughts. I want you to ask yourselves two questions. What can nature do for me, for my business, for my interests, for the outcomes I'm responsible for? But also ask yourselves, when is too little nature starting to become a problem for me? As a colleague of mine memorably said yesterday, I don't think we'll ever have a problem with too much nature, but we've certainly got a problem with too little at the moment. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Marion. So I'd now like to hear our responses to the report. And first, I'd like to introduce Rachel Solomon-Williams, Executive Director from the Aldersgate Group. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. It's a real honour, and congratulations to Natural England on what's a really important and insightful report, which I hope will go far and wide after today's launch. Briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Aldersgate Group, we're a membership organisation primarily for large businesses. So I'm here to talk to you about the business perspective on this report. We also have green NGOs and academic institutions in membership as well. So our business members are those who want to take faster action on protecting the environment and addressing climate change. And we work with them to develop policy solutions which we take into government and discuss there. So I give you some examples of our businesses. We've got lots of banks, supermarkets, furniture manufacturers, engineering contractors. It goes right across the economy. So we really try to take that cross-sectoral view of how these different issues impact on the business community and on society. I wanted to start by saying that the natural environment is critical infrastructure. I don't think I've heard that said yet this morning, but if we want to build a resilient economy, we should be thinking about nature in the same way as we're thinking about pylons or roads or any of those other pieces of infrastructure that we see as important in society. And supporting nature recovery will be absolutely vital to delivering this government's growth mission, as has already been mentioned. I wanted to think a bit about how businesses look at nature. So every business has a different objective. They all, by definition, need to be able to generate a profit. And so the question for every business is, how can I integrate the protection of nature into that profit motive in a way that can generate good for both us and for it? And they tend to look through both risk and opportunity lenses at all of these issues. The challenge is how to make sure they really understand what all those risks and opportunities are properly. I think this report is a really important contribution to helping to do that. In March this year, the climate advisory firm Pollination, who are one of our members, commissioned a legal opinion which found that company board directors had duties to consider how their business affected and depended on nature. So this is another really important finding. The analysis said that directors of UK firms faced serious personal consequences for breaching these duties, potentially including claims for damages or compensation by their shareholders. So this is a serious matter for shareholders and directors, and they are beginning to understand that much more all the time. The landmark finding that I've just described demonstrates quite how seriously businesses must take nature risks as well as climate risks, and they need to think about those things together. There are lots of other lenses through which businesses look at nature and natural assets. Firstly, dependency, supply chains. Where do they rely on specific individual products and supply chains which are based on nature? Where might those supply chains be at risk? The report sets out lots of those. Food, pharmaceuticals, furniture production. I could go on and on in terms of where sectors are exposed to nature risk in a very direct way. Regulation and compliance. What new requirements will be placed on business to protect nature or to report on how they're protecting nature? Biodiversity net gain is one that we've already got in this country, and it's really interesting to see how that's working. It's at least created a very specific focus on what certain kinds of business must do, which is an excellent kind of test bed in a sense for how that idea might be developed further in future. Forest risk commodities regulations, which are being very much discussed in DEFRA and beyond at the moment, are another example of where regulations are being brought in to ensure that businesses take the right approach in how they make decisions. Another lens is moral compass and ESG. So many businesses, our members definitely included, are very concerned to make sure that they're just doing the right thing and that they can report that to their shareholders, but also feel confident that what they're doing good in the world as well as working for the health of their businesses. What should they actually be doing? What's the right way of demonstrating moral compass and kind of working on their ESG approach? And it's not always easy for them to understand what those things actually are. Opportunity. So we talked about opportunity. There's a lot of focus on risk in this report, and rightly so. But actually, there are lots of ways in which investing in nature can generate opportunity for different kinds of businesses. It's, again, not always easy to understand exactly what those are and to balance out the short-term opportunities with those long-term ones, and really helping boardrooms to think long-term, I think, is crucial to getting this right. And then markets. I have spent a lot of time in the last year having conversations about nature markets with all sorts of different stakeholders, from a finance point of view, from a natural assets point of view, from a landowner point of view. What exactly are nature markets going to be? How are we going to define the edges of that? A 2022 report by the Task Force on Nature Markets valued global nature markets as being worth $98 billion annually. But what does that even mean? How's it going to manifest itself in the real world? And I think that's one of the issues that we're going to be working very closely on in the coming months, because until we can understand what the markets are trading in and who is going to be interested in those units and credits, it's going to be very difficult to get them off the ground properly. So I think I've said quite a lot of times now, it's hard for businesses to understand what to do. There's a lack of data, and this report's really welcome because it adds to that kind of pile of evidence, which helps, in particular, sustainability directors who are thinking about this kind of thing every day to go to their boards and their CEOs and say, here is the evidence that shows we absolutely need to integrate this into a high-level business strategy. You know, you're producing climate transition plans. Most large businesses are now producing climate transition plans. So how can we integrate nature into those transition plans in a meaningful way, and why is it absolutely vital that we do that? Just to give a few examples of how this report relates to those CEO level decisions. It describes risk. So there's a risk rating for each ecosystem and the benefits it provides. Identification of those ecosystems and the benefits that are at high and medium-high risk, which is nearly all of them as far as I can tell, and what's driving this risk. And then a risk register for providing a method for assessing natural capital risk. So that's a really vital way of helping, again, those sustainability directors to take and advise on sensible decision making. And then it talks about actions and opportunities for investment. So what are the priority actions to reduce risks to economic resilience, net zero, climate adaptation, food security, health and well-being, water security? Really vital source of information about that. And the priority actions to take in each of those ecosystems. And then as well, an appendix of indicators and data with indicators that can be used to measure change in the state of ecosystems assets over time, and highlighting data gaps, so that I imagine that this will be a kind of ongoing process of filling those gaps and working alongside others who are in this area, in this space as well. And I know that DEFRA are taking this very seriously. I'd also highlight the section at the back on bringing natural capital into decision making. I'd almost have put that bit on the front page. What's the point of this report? Actually, it's to make sure that decision makers can do their jobs better. And that means decision makers in government and also in businesses. Businesses are already taking a lot of voluntary action on nature, but they'd love to see greater clarity about where they really can add value, potentially through regulation. So businesses, I say this in every presentation I give, they're very happy to be regulated as long as it's designed carefully and implemented properly. And if that means that all businesses are brought along at the same pace as those who are leading, that's the best result we can get. An example of this is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, where a lot of businesses are already reporting voluntarily under that framework. We would like to see that made mandatory, and a lot of our members would like that too, because it means that then everybody has to do it, and most importantly, those sustainability directors can go to their board and say, now this is something we have to do, and the reporting that we do will help us to make better decisions and investments in the future. We're very much looking forward to the review of the Environmental Improvement Plan that's happening at the moment, and we're grateful to DEFRA for involving as many stakeholders in that process as they can. That's been a fantastic process so far, but I think that's where the rubber really hits the road. So that plan will contain, as I hope, very specific actions for what government wants to do, but also how they expect businesses to respond to that and to contribute to change. We're also looking forward to the much anticipated land use framework, which I hope will integrate with the EIP as much as possible, and look forward to the clarity that that will offer about the role that businesses can play. I think my job now is just to say thank you very much and well done, and hand over to James Vause, who's a lead economist for the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre.
Right. So I was asked to do a little bit of talking about the Dasgupta Review and how this might help implement the Dasgupta Review in England. I was asked to do that because I worked on it a little bit through another project. I'll copy Rachel though first, in case people don't know UNEP WCMC. We're a UN collaborative centre in Cambridge. We specialise on biodiversity. We're about 220 people now, 40 of whom work on nature economy related issues. I've put this as a reminder. It might not be a reminder to everyone. This is a slide from the Dasgupta Review, and it's talking about what transitions were needed. So what changes we needed to see in the economy if we were going to have an economy that was embedded within nature. And he had three different areas. So they're the ones in the bottom right-hand corner here. I'll come back to this, but one was balancing something that he called the impact inequality. So on the left-hand side of that, you had the demands on nature. On the right-hand side, you had the capacity of nature to meet those demands. He estimated that it was imbalanced to a degree of about 1.6. So we are demanding 1.6 times what nature can supply. The next area was around changing our measures of success. So what do we think is a successful economy and how do we measure that? And the other area was around transforming institutions and systems. So the way we take nature into account systematically. And it had lots of different areas in there. The balancing the impact inequality is maybe the biophysical approach, thinking how we can do that. And as I say, changes of measures of success is about what you're aiming for. And then the institutions, the Dasgupta Review focused on finance and education, but it also includes all of our policy making and things like that. So that's the context. Why is it important? Why is that transformation needed? This is quite a dull-looking graph, but it's got a quite stark story in it. It comes from the Inclusive Wealth Report, which came out last year. Inclusive wealth is a measure of all the assets that we need to sustain our well-being. And what you really want, if you want to have an increasing level of well-being in society, it has to be backed by an increasing level of wealth per capita. And this is a global picture. You can see that produced capital per capita going up, good. Human capital per capita going up, good. Natural capital per capita has declined by 50% since 1990, which is quite a big number. And that's also driven reductions in inclusive wealth per capita. So whilst we've seen GDP per capita going up, that's on a decreasing asset base, which suggests that we are consuming our asset base to increase our consumption at the moment, which is quite a scary story when you start translating it into the scale of risks. There was a report from Oxford University that said these nature-related risks are another $5 trillion of risk, value at risk in the global economy that amplify what's happening with climate change. So the numbers are really, really big. At a global level, that is. This little figure is one that I quite like for explaining the interactions between the economy and nature. So at the top, we've got economic sectors, and they have impacts. Those impacts change the state of natural capital assets, and the change in state of assets changes the inputs available into the economic system. And what's lovely about the State of Natural Capital report is it explains what's going on the bottom half of this circle, which tends to be what gets ignored. And it's because of the way the economy works, really. So if you've got an input that's suddenly unavailable, a type of nut or a type of wood, you don't think, oh, maybe I should monitor and repair the ecosystem. You think, oh, I wonder which other wood or nut I can buy from another source. And then you move on. Or you think, oh dear, the water's polluted. Well, let's invest in a bottled water industry. And then GDP carries on growing, but your ecological foundations carry on getting eroded. And that's where these risks start to build up. And I saw a lovely quote from Partha Dasgupta, one of the collection of awards he's had since the Dasgupta Review. And he was being interviewed about how his thought process had evolved. He talked about this story about the goods that we get from nature and how we tend to think about substituting them. And I'll read it out because he's much better and much more articulate than me. He says, of course, we care about nature's goods like water, food, and clothing, because without them, we wouldn't be here. But none of this would exist without the underlying processes of nature. So he's moved on to thinking about protecting the assets for those processes and the water cycle, the climate cycle, those kind of things. And that's what you need to protect the assets for and focus on the condition of the assets. So I thought that was really cool, and I think it reflects well on what's been explored in the State of Natural Capital report. So then I thought, where next? Where can you take the evidence that's in the SONC report? And we've heard a lot of it already. So on balancing the impact inequality, the report highlights that, we've got a lot of problems, and we've got a lot of places where we can correct things so we can improve the state of our assets. And that's a kind of place-based decision. What you need to do will vary from ecosystem type to economic activity type. And as was stated as well, sometimes it's not a financial cost, it's a cost in terms of learning how to do things differently. So maybe learning how to invest to reduce flood risk in a different way, or doing farming differently, those kind of things. But then I was thinking about this transforming institutions and systems. And there, maybe we're not looking to the place-based questions. Maybe there we're looking to understanding the cumulative impacts or the aggregate impacts and translating what's in this report into metrics that suddenly make it more meaningful, say for a central bank. If you translate those shocks in food supply into an inflation shock, then you've got the Bank of England involved. If you attach the risks to economic productivity to tax revenues from different sectors, then you've got an argument for your kind of fiscal policy makers to understand why nature's important. So that's where I was trying to go with thinking about how you could use this differently. And it's about understanding the transmission mechanisms, so how the changes in the state of nature push through. And then I had this thought about what's been flagged quite a lot. We've got a bit of a pay now, pay later dynamic going on, because we can pay now. We can do the place-based stuff better. We can restore our assets, or we can just leave it and wait and see what happens. There was a report out from the Green Finance Institute that looked at a few scenarios of nature decline around the world, and highlighted the potential in, quite reasonable looking scenarios of things we might expect to happen for a shock to UK GDP of around 12%, which is significantly more than the costs of COVID. So worth bearing in mind. So that was that. And then my other thing was, don't forget that the UK depends on an awful lot more natural capital assets around the world than the ones in the UK as well. I think in the National Ecosystem Assessment, it said that I think it was 70% of our water consumption in the UK comes from embedded water. So we've got a big impact and a big thought process to go through there as well. I think that might have been what, that was it. Yeah.
Brilliant, James. Thank you very much for that. Very thought-provoking. So it's now my pleasure to invite back Ruth, who's going to be chairing our panel, and also our panel members. So if you could come up to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is this working?
Yes.
Excellent. Do a very good Wuthering Heights. So I think Tony is doing a press. Yeah, so Tony's just come in. So I'd like in the interim to really welcome the panel. It's really lovely to have you. So at the far end is Jane Lusardi, who's our principal specialist in natural capital. So Jane knows the detail of the report. So if you've got really stinky, detailed questions, I'm going to pass them on to Jane. I've got some in case you guys don't ask any. And then next up is Rachel Solomon-Williams, who we've already heard from Exec Director of Audidate Group and a trustee of Rewilding Britain. And then I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Mel Austin. Mel's a Natural England board member, but also Professor of Ocean and Society at the University of Plymouth. And we'll have Tony up here so you can think of some stinky questions for him as well, because, he's absent at the beginning. So later on, Tony will sneak onto the stage. So as we said earlier, there are opportunities to put questions in the Slido, and I've got some assistants who are going to keep passing me some questions as well. But I thought I'd kind of kick off actually by asking the panel a kind of more general question about James touched on this a little bit, but what strategic decisions or decision makers does the panel think are a particular priority from reading the report and for having a look at the report? And I just wonder if you might kind of give us, Natural England, some pointers as where do you think we should start when we start taking this out? So if it's okay, I might ask Mel first.
Thanks, Ruth. That was the first of the stinky questions, wasn't it? Okay, so I do look at things particularly through a marine lens. So I perhaps am going to take a sort of marine view of this. For example, I'd like to see the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero pay quite a lot of attention to this report. From the marine environment, there's a huge expansion of offshore wind underway at the moment, and we need to get that right. We need to do it because we need net zero, but we also need to do it in the right way. So the decisions that are going on there are critically important. Probably also bring in that case, also the Crown Estate as the major seabed owners, who've also got a role in that decision making. So I think it is about bringing this nature, natural capital, the marine nature, into those really big economic growth sectors. And in the marine environment, that's the offshore wind.
That's great. Thanks, Mel. And just moving along to Rachel.
Thank you. I think building on those points, really, there's a plethora of strategies about to hit the deck from different bits of government, which all relate to this. There's a review of the planning system happening at the moment, the way those planning regulations will work. I mentioned already the environment, it's just gone out of my head, Environmental Improvement Plan, which is really the most important document in terms of identifying where policy interventions are going to be made around the natural environment. But as Mel says, it's really important that doesn't exist in isolation and is consistent with all the other plans. I think it's a really heroic task, and one that, I've been a civil servant before, and trying to join together multiple different strategies across different departments, I'm not sure it's ever really been done at the sort of extent that's needed at the moment. So the energy systems planning that's happening at the moment in the new NESO, really exciting, and they've talked about the importance of factoring in nature, which is great. The question is how that really happens and who they talk to in making it happen. We haven't even talked about Department for Transport, and I think there's an integrated transport strategy coming over the horizon at some point too. Making sure that everything is as integrated as possible while also not getting kind of bogged down is also difficult, because it could take 5 years to produce strategies that are all integrated, at which point we've missed all those 2030 targets. So can we identify some quick wins as well, where it's obviously going to be beneficial across all those sectors and we can just get on with it? And in particular, because I need to say this, giving business a really clear steer about what they can do as well.
No, that sounds great, Rachel. I'm going to pass it on to Jane, but that's a long list there for us. Thanks. Jane, have you got any thoughts where you think we should start?
And we obviously started with the report in terms of focusing on those key policy areas. But I think it's really important to remember as well that we identified the risks and we identified the opportunities and actions, and those actions actually apply across a whole suite. It's about it's delivering right the way across government. And we identified a number of policy areas to focus on, but we could have chosen more. We've just chosen some that are where it's particularly dependent on the state of nature. And we really wanted to get that across. So we've kind of identified that as a starter, but that's not just where we want to stop. It's really about, recognizing that, if nature is at risk, then it puts policy at risk. But if it's in a good condition, it can actually help us to deliver policy in those areas and beyond, really.
Yeah, and I think, the other thing that maybe we didn't kind of say enough about earlier on was that, in invest in nature, it actually provides benefits across a whole range of policy areas. So it's not siloed, it's integrated in of itself, hence calling it ecosystems. So I'm going to move on to some questions that we've got from the audience. It says there's been a number of questions about the government's growth missions. How does the panel see the report playing into the government's growth missions? Tony, I wonder if I could start with you on that one.
Well, I think what we've presented today. It's a kind of overview of the connections between the economic ambitions for the country and how that's underpinned by nature. And I think then the next steps are going to be about how we start to reflect that in decision making, aren't they? And how growth can truly reflect the dependence that it has on the natural world. There have been various attempts to do this over the years, haven't there? And I think it's fair to say that we've been challenged by this. I mean, Rachel's point about the multiple efforts to do more integrated thinking, they haven't yet achieved the breakthroughs that we need. And actually, I'm just reflecting back onto what I recall probably as the first attempt to do this back in 1990. When Chris Patten, who was then Margaret Thatcher's Environment Minister, launched the Environment White Paper back then, a part of which was to name a green minister in every department, and they were working as a group to be able to try and draw together common threads that they could implement across the whole piece. Didn't quite work. Various attempts made since to be able to do better, but I think we're back at that place again. And as Rachel pointed out, this point about integrated delivery, it is absolutely critical, but the how is the thing. And actually, one thing we pick out in this report that certainly has struck me as being a fruitful area to look at over the years has been incorporating some level of natural capital measurement inside our overall national economic indicator, which presently is GDP, which is great in terms of understanding patterns of consumption and demand and, economic kind of transactions in the economy. But there's no visibility in that number of the state of nature, which we're confirming today is declining. And that is an economic issue because in the end, it will feed back into GDP. And we've heard some examples of that today. So if we were to include the state of nature alongside some other possible indicators that you could put in a more comprehensive economic assessment, we might get further with this, because then it would start at the top of what we're trying to do in terms of our measure of progress. So there may be something there for colleagues at Treasury to be thinking about in terms of whether we've now reached the point where we have enough information and we have good enough data to be able to start feeding these numbers in. And then other colleagues in different organisations would say, actually, the other thing we need to be putting in there is a sense of our global footprint. Quite a lot of what we're importing here has got a massive carbon and biodiversity footprint on the other side of the world. And should we go down this natural capital path here and be protecting our own nature, what we don't want to do is be offshoring the impacts to Brazil or to Indonesia or wherever else. And so being able to capture a sense of that too. I mean, instantly, this is getting quite complicated. But then again, GDP is not necessarily that simple either. And so I think probably, amongst the very gifted economists we have in this country, it should be possible to start working through how to do this. And actually, maybe there's a piece of work we could do at Natural England to convene some of the economics departments and academics and thinkers to be looking at ways in which we might do that, because we've recommended it in the report. Maybe the next step is to start thinking about how we do that.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. And actually, the Dasgupta review did sort of recommend inclusive wealth, which is, including natural capital alongside productive capital and human capital to try and bring that into decision making. And I think there's probably more we can do there to try and kind of push that along. And places like New Zealand have been trialing that kind of approach. So, I think that would be really interesting for us to have a further look at that. So the next question we've got is, we've had a few questions around opportunity, inequality and social justice. Do we think we can include a social justice framework within this natural capital approach? I might direct that at Jane to begin with. That counts as one of the stinky questions for Jane, I think. So she'll hit me later for that one.
I think there's a real piece, particularly, and Marion talks about urban, and I think there's a real piece in the urban space where we really need to think about inequality and how we can look at, we're talking about multifunctional green spaces that can really deliver. We're not just talking about access to nature, we're talking about green spaces that also help to reduce flooding, that also help to improve air quality, that also provide cooling. It's a whole suite of things that we want our urban spaces to do. And at the moment, there's lots of lovely green space in our wealthier areas and not so much in our poorer communities. And it's about addressing that, seeing how that can be addressed within the kind of growth agenda, within the building new houses, but making sure that that's an absolute key part of it. I mean, it pays off many times. There's lots of evidence in the report about this. It gives people, it improves productivity, it reduces the number of sick days. It's all this sort of thing. And it's about looking at making sure that we're getting this green space in the right places for those communities to really address that inequality. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thanks, Jane. I think Mel would like to comment.
Yeah, again, I'll just give a little sort of a bit of a marine flavour to this, if you don't mind. So at the coast, we have an influx of tourists who love being by the sea but use the natural capital. They're attracted by the natural capital of the sea, but they're also users of it. They add to the burden. We've got coastal communities that are dependent on the fishing industry and all that goes around that. And it's not a particularly, despite what the natural capital report says, in terms of economies, it's not a huge economic effect, but it has a big, big social impact in those coastal communities. Aquaculture is a growing industry, but that also impacts and conflicts with some of the tourism, the leisure and recreation. So when it comes to the people-y stuff out the coast, there's a huge amount of interaction that I think, the sort of social justice thing comes in here about how we use the natural capital. Even if we go back to the offshore wind criteria, will that provide jobs? Will it provide nature? And which bit of nature gets impacted and which bit of society gets impacted when the stuff comes on shore? So there are huge cables that come ashore, and they have to come ashore in some of the most beautiful parts of the coastal habitat, affecting both the natural capital and the people who appreciate that natural capital. So again, there is a social justice question there that I think we can do more to untangle those impacts.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. And I think it's really interesting as well because alongside Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, in the last couple of weeks, there's been a launch of a task force, and I'm not going to get the acronym quite right, but it's for inequality and social inclusion as well. So obviously in that sector, they're also seeing this need to really start bringing this into decision making. So, I think that is something we need to think about as we take this report forward. So moving on to the next question, how do panel members see the work helping governments, current and future, make nature a priority up there with the NHS, education and defence? So, this is something I guess we quite often feel is we're down the pecking order. People do care, but, maybe not immediately compared to some of these other sectors. Rachel, I wonder if there's any comment you can kind of make about how we try and, get up there so that we've got equal billing.
Thank you. I went to a really interesting panel at the Labour Party conference about investment and what we mean. There's a big conversation happening out there at the moment about the kind of value of public investment and rationale for the government putting money into certain sectors versus trying to attract private sector capital into those areas. And I think this is one of those, the kind of most tricky areas like that. And the conversation went very quickly into interaction with industrial strategy. So where does the edge of just public investment for public goods stop? And where's the beginning of public investment to support industrial development? And what do we mean by industry? So this is quite a big answer, but I think that we have to look at everything in the round like that. So where do we think we should just spend public money for public goods, and can we define what those are? Can we help the Treasury to understand the valuation of those assets better and to really mean it? I think it's almost a cultural and a choice to be made that those things are as important as GDP, and that they matter as much to voters as the state of hospitals, the state of schools, and all the things, and the state of rubbish collections, and all those other things. If voters are telling them on the doorstep that matters to them, that is what gets into the kind of decision-making head. I was thinking about industrial strategy as well in the kind of context of the other two questions. So obviously the growth mission has a focus around industrial strategy. We don't know what that is yet. There's a bit of a risk that it's a list of sectors and some cash. And actually, it would be really helpful if it could paint a wider picture of how do we see these different economic sectors growing in this country, where are the opportunities, and how can we make sure that we take communities with us? Because we've got the concept of a just transition happening in climate policy, so helping energy communities to transition from coal-based production to new industries. But what does that mean in terms of nature recovery as well? And can we join together those just transition concepts while we do an industrial strategy?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I mean, Tony, I wondered if you had any comments on how we bring us up to equal billing.
I don't have much to add to what's already been said, except that what we're talking about today, I think, is a massive reframing of some of the assumptions that shape our relationship with the natural world. And, we've had this thing called environment in inverted commas for the last 50 years. And what it turned into quite quickly was something that we balanced against growth. And the usual kind of upshot of that was, well, we need growth for jobs and for well-being and for wealth creation. And it's regrettable, but it's inevitable that we're going to have to sacrifice the environment to achieve it. What we're saying today is that that strategy needs tipping on its head, in the sense of, if we're going to have growth into the future, we have to rebuild the health of nature because it underpins the growth. And so that reframing, I think, is essential in order to do all the things that have just been described. And hopefully what we've put out today will start to equip people with some of the tools to be able to think about things slightly differently. Investing in nature becomes an investment in future growth rather than an unaffordable cost that we can't tolerate at a time of tight public finances. It's quite a fundamental different take on what we're seeing in terms of those stats about, disappearing animals and plants and lost habitats. It's a completely different way of thinking about it. And I think that then will change the status of this discussion in terms of, how it compares with defence and health service and everything else.
I think that's what we really hope for as well. And I think with nature, what we think, and some of the work that Oxford University have done, has found that, some of these risks are much shorter term than maybe when you compare them to climate. And also they can be much more localised, so you can feel them much more immediately. So, I think they are trying to make that connection, not just with individual people and nature, but also businesses, the economy and society and nature. So there is much more embedded in an informed way is really what we're trying to do. I've got a kind of health-related question here. How can we use the report to support the government's health mission and build wider partnerships to recognise nature as a critical health infrastructure? So I think that leads slightly on what Rachel was saying about we need to think about it as infrastructure. I mean, Jane, shall I ask you to kick that one off?
Yeah. So again, we've got a section of the report that talks about health and well-being and the consequences of the risk, but it also does set out, the actions that we can take. And I think there's so much in the report about how nature is so important in terms of our physical but particularly our mental health. And I think it's about getting that across, and getting across the fact that nature, and I suppose this links back to the last question really, is thinking about nature as part of our infrastructure, so that infrastructure is not just built infrastructure, that we've got this nature as part of our infrastructure and we invest in it in that way. Because in terms of health, we've got stats on the effect that flooding has on people's mental health is huge. The effects that, we've got the positive effects of getting out. We've got those lovely figures about, children and what children being happy by being out there. But we really need to, there's talk about having a preventative approach, and it's really about nature being a really critical part of that preventative approach, and really, making it integral to that. So it's, so that it's getting people out there, getting people the access, as we talked about before, dealing with those inequalities and really having it there. But it's not just, it's a whole suite of things as well. It's about the risks, in terms of the risks in terms of water quality, risks in terms of flooding. We've got a whole suite of different air quality, a whole suite of risks that nature can really help us to deal with. Risks in terms of, they're scary, those figures about heat and what that does in urban areas. And that's, even in England, that's going to get worse. And these are the sorts of things that, if we're doing stuff now to, improve our green and blue spaces in urban areas, that we can really, build that in for the future. And we need to be thinking about preventative stuff in the long term. We need to be, thinking about what that's going to mean in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, when the climate's going to have changed as well, and where we're going to need to be adapting more. So we really need to be, it comes back to, Marion's piece about let's act now. We really need to do that.
Thanks, Jane. So an awful lot in there, and I think that reliance on health and well-being and the connection with nature is really important. Did anybody else want to comment on that one? Rachel, thank you.
Just briefly, I think what I meant to say before about the missions, one excellent thing about the missions is they genuinely are trying to bring together different bits of government and have the Prime Minister really owning the outcomes. And it may be that we get to actually thinking about health not just as how much we spend on the NHS, but all those other inputs as well by creating that mission approach. So fingers crossed, that does actually give a hook for building in some of these preventative measures as well. I'm hopeful.
Just one further thought on this preventative side. So if you look at some of the stats, there's some really quite terrifying numbers that you see over recent years in terms of the prescription of antidepressants and also the number of people suffering from type 2 diabetes, which in turn requires a lot of medication. And one less known of consequence of that is a very significant increase in pharmaceutical pollution in wastewater. And so we see biological effects of this on fish and invertebrates in rivers as a result of these chemicals that go straight through the human body, Prozac, metformin, get into the water, and which then are causing damage to nature in terms of aquatic environments. And then, okay, so what are you going to do about that? So one thing you might do is spend a lot of money on trying to remove those chemicals before the water is discharged back into the environment. This requires a massive investment of energy and technology, very, very expensive, and which has led to Wessex Water doing some experimental work in the Somer Valley near Bath, whereby they are investing in green spaces for the local community who are deprived in terms of social deprivation indicators, in order to give them places where they can exercise and have mental health benefits, thereby potentially to reduce the prescription of those kinds of drugs, thereby reducing the cost of the water company in the future. This is really interesting, I think, in terms of how some of these dots are being joined up. And hopefully, again, one of the things we can do today is inspire a little bit more of that kind of business case thinking. So, Wessex Water, obviously, they'd have a concern about the health of their consumers, but they're coming to that with a business case whereby they're investing in the green space because they think they might get a return. I mean, the point applies to the whole of society, and hopefully people in the health service are thinking about that in terms of, the money we can save as a country in avoiding those prescriptions, because there were obviously an economic upside there as well as obviously the benefits for individuals who are not depressed or not suffering from the consequences of inactivity, which nature, does some of that for us.
No, thanks, Tony. I think I didn't know about that project. It's really interesting. I really like the way they are joining the dots up there. Mel, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, I got struck by something that James said when he looked at his circular diagram, and he said, most of the people in the sectors, the business sectors, and presumably in this case the health sector, look at the top stuff and say, well, if it's broken, we just buy another widget, or we invent another tablet, or we find another treatment. And I was sort of thinking, no, I always look at the bottom bit because that's my job. And what I think the report has shown is that all of these things are quite interactive. So people's health is dependent on water quality, on having a safe and healthier supply of food, on being able to interact with the natural environment. So all of those risks that are highlighted in the report are interactively the things that, if we could fix many of those, we'd also be fixing people's human health. And I think, that's why we need to keep looking at that bottom bit and trying to persuade the people at the top that actually it's not just go out and develop a new cure, develop something else at a huge expense, but actually we could just try using, exactly as Tony has said, some of the stuff at the bottom around the natural environment, fix the natural environment and many of those problems. If we can get people to interact with the natural environment and facilitate that, would actually be preventative and would help as well.
Yeah, and I think I think that's really true. The other thing is, it's not an either or, nature or a tablet. It's how do they work together? How can we improve the overall offer, I suppose, for people, and not just fix one thing, but fix multiple things at the same time. I think that's really great. Okay, I've got one more a question a bit more around placemaking. Can the evidence and the key findings, do we think, be applied at combined authority or a local authority level? I'm going to start with Jane, but I think I might ask some other folks about, how we can use this approach on a more place-based level.
I mean, obviously, this is an England scale report. We're reporting our indicators and everything at an England scale. But actually, a lot of those, not all of them, but a number of those indicators can be cut by those more kind of local scales, more kind of regional scales. But I think more than that is that actually the approach, if we want to make these 3 big changes that we're talking about, we need to be making those in places as well. We need to make these things happen on the ground. So the key messages in the report, the key findings in the report, all the evidence that's in the report is still applicable in a place. It's not, somebody's not going to necessarily go and do your work I come from Lancaster, in Lancaster, but that doesn't mean that you can't pull in this evidence. It gives us a way of talking to people that we're not already talking to who are not already realizing that nature, is either, poses a risk because of the risks to nature, or is an opportunity. So it's very much, it can be applied, and it absolutely does need to be applied at local scales and in local places.
Thanks, Jane. Is there any comments from the rest of the panel on that one? Mel?
Just to say, I think some of this already does happen in local authorities and at local level. I know that, we had the pilot programs for the forgotten which strategy it was, but in North Devon there's a biosphere. They've got a local natural capital plan already. They will look at this report and go, oh, we could do better, we could do more, we could try some different things, we could look at what we've already got and improve on it and develop further strategies. Cornwall does the same thing as well. So I think a lot of authorities are already in this space, and I think I'd like to think that we need to just get the report out to them and say, here's some more pointers on how you can use the thinking that you already started to do better.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, particularly the risk register in it is maybe a way of presenting the information in a slightly different way. The Natural Capital Committee did do a risk register quite a long time ago in a slightly different methodology. So we're hoping that, highlighting some of these risks and the implications, is useful at whatever scale you're working at. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions here about finance. I'm going to sort of roll together and see what you can do. Will the report provide a paradigm shift in using public finance? And here's one. Who pays? Is investment in natural capital expected to provide a financial return that private investors can capture? Or is it more akin to an insurance premium? So I wonder if, Rachel, if I can kick you off, but I'll try and see if I can ask other folks to come in on some of that. Just a few tricky bits in there.
I mean, those are the questions, right? So all this comes down to who's responsible for action, how do we allocate cost across the economy, and the government will come out with something on the 30th of October where they say, we haven't got loads of money, so we want to target it in a few places, and we expect the private sector to come in behind, we want to crowd in private sector investment. Great. Is it going to make a return for investors? That's a very live conversation at the moment, and I think not really fully tested is the answer to the question. Biodiversity net gain is a kind of tiny test in it's created a market for what will be sort of nature credits, and landowners are looking for ways of offering biodiversity net gain credits to housing developers and so on. Will that offer a way to make that investable? Really, is very hard to tell, and I think it's a very sort of philosophical question about, as well as a hard financial one, about how we want to value nature and whether we think it is just a public good or something where it should add value back. I really love the example about Wessex Water, and that is an example where if they're right, then it will offer them a return, but we don't know yet. And it's got to be this really long-term thinking in that instance. Probably there are lots of other examples where it's also very long-term thinking, and so investors need to be patient. It's going to be particular kinds of investors who are willing to come to the table around this. I know that Aviva investors, one of our members, have put £40 million into a Welsh rainforest, which they see as a long-term investment from their point of view, and that's really exciting. But they're probably the leading, kind of at the leading edge of companies. They work in insurance and they really get it. I think if you're further down the chain or it's less close to what you're doing, we don't know yet, is what I'm saying in a long way.
No, I think that's true. And I was having a conversation earlier at coffee this morning about the length of time to get rewards, if you like, as a business, and how they can be quite long term in ways you were describing, and how that can be a little bit demotivating maybe for some of the businesses that aren't so, directly sort of drawn into the role that nature plays for them. And we were talking about, what alternative ways can we reward some of those businesses along the way until the kind of final return comes in. Tony, I wondered if you had any comments around, whether the report will provide this paradigm shift in using public finance and who pays, whether there's some kind of combination we should be going for.
Yeah, so on the public finance, Mariam made this point earlier on, is that, that there is definitely an opportunity to use the money that we're already spending in a more integrated way. And actually, you mentioned, Ruth, a moment ago, the Natural Capital Committee. And I remember one piece of work they did looking at the Thames Basin, and they identified, I think it was 22 sources of public money going into the landscape. And some of that money was being spent in opposition, if you will. So some subsidies going in that were causing pollution and land degradation, and then other subsidies coming in to clean up the mess. And, that is literally a waste of public money. So taking a more strategic view of how we're spending what we've already got could take us quite a long way, I think. So, for example, if you looked at a river catchment as your unit of kind of nature recovery and natural capital assessment, what would happen if you spent the agricultural incentives, the flood reduction incentives, and the investments by the water companies, plus what we're putting in for protected areas and what the Forestry Commission is spending on trees, if you had a way of using all those budgets together to maximise the natural capital values we're talking about today in terms of access to beautiful areas for people to enjoy, flood risk reduction, soil conservation, water purity and nature recovery, what would be the effect of spending all that money through a single plan rather than scattering the money across the landscape on a series of largely unrelated projects? And I think that's a very interesting experiment for us to think through in terms of how we can do that. And back to the last question about local authorities, what we do have underway at the moment is a process of local nature recovery strategies being prepared by local authorities. And you might hope that that could be the kind of template that could receive public funds in a much more joined up way, recognising also that there is an increasingly clear business case, made clearer again today by this report, for the private sector to be investing in nature alongside government. And actually, that would be an additional body of finance coming into those same landscapes. And actually the water sector, they are closest to quite a lot of these natural capital values. And there are quite a few examples across the country of where investments in nature are yielding dividends in a way which make business sense. A couple of examples. One is the upstream thinking program of South West Water, where they've been investing in the restoration of the blanket bogs on Dartmoor in order to avoid organic material coming off the hillside, which means they need less chemicals and less energy to purify the water for public supply. It's a business case, and it's a very strong one. Anglian Water in the east of England have been working with the Rivers Trusts to invest in engineered wetlands to put on the end of rural sewage treatment works, which is basically delivering Perrier quality water into the headwater streams of really important chalk rivers. And that's being done again with reduced energy and reduced chemicals, thereby saving money and creating a habitat in the process. So the question is, how can we do more of this? How can we incentivize that private sector investment by making the business case clearer? Again, we've got a contribution today from this report. How do we make that more granular? How do we extend it into other sectors? Insurance is mentioned. I mean, just look at what's in the news again today. If you're an insurance company looking at what is now coming down the track, you should be very worried. And one way to take the edge off of some of these extreme events is to invest in natural capital. And so, maybe there's an opportunity now to start researching that through maybe some partnerships with the insurance industry to look at how we might line up public finance, private finance, how they might start to change their investment strategies to favour some of this. TNFD is a piece in there, so you can see who's putting money and investing in what. So potentially quite an exciting time. But I think as Rachel said a moment ago, and as we've discussed on this panel already, the key to this is integration. We've got to start integrating budgets, integrating actions, integrating the different people who are going to be involved, and we then need to be integrating the outcomes so that we can layer all these natural capital values on top of each other as much as possible in particular places. Hence, Natural England's emphasis now on place-based delivery, which is another upshot of what we're talking about this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. And I was reflecting as well, with Mel with her marine hat on, that actually, marine's not on its own, is it? It's integrated with what comes off the land, what comes down the rivers, into our seas as well. So there's a bit of a shift there as well, that I think we need to be much more integrated across lands, rivers and seas in ways that maybe we haven't been so good at. I mean, Mel, I just wondered if you had any good examples on the marine side of sort of public-private finance coming together, or, any examples that you've come across in that sector? Blank. Well, there we go. More to do in that space then, I think. Yeah, that was a naive question from my half. Sorry, dropping you in it there. Okay, so just moving on then from those ones. This question says, the evidence is really clear, but it's a struggle to make sure decision makers take it into account. How do we ensure this amazing report really lands? It does say amazing, I didn't put that bit in. But, have the panel got some suggestions about, how do we get it to land? We've had lots of examples, I think, of ways of trying to access and get into those conversations. Is there more we can kind of say on that? Yeah, Rachel, thank you.
I'd say it's what you're saying and making it granular and real. So if you go to a particular government department, minister, civil servants, whoever else, why is it important to that individual person? What can they do next that will have an impact? And try. If you just plonk a report down on the desk, they'll go, lovely, looks really interesting, thanks very much. And then nothing will happen. So I think it's kind of a challenge back, really, which is how many specific actions can we pull out and take forward? And then it is definitely about being in the room and having those conversations face to face. You can publish as many reports as you like, but actually kind of having the opportunity to discuss it and really work through the consequences is the most important thing. So that's not rocket science, but I think that is literally the best thing, and making sure that they hear it from not just you as well. They need to hear it from me, and also lots of other people in this room, I'm imagining, who can make the case and be really consistent about how the case is being made from lots of different channels.
Thanks, Rachel. And Jane was going to comment.
Thanks, Rachel. That's just exactly what we want to hear. It's, we see this as like a starting point. This is launch, and that's, we don't want this to be a report that then goes on a shelf and is then just forgotten about. We want to be talking to people that we haven't been talking to already. We want to be understanding how we can make our evidence more accessible to people. We want to understand what people need, what will actually make a difference. So it's very much, this is, it's been quite a lot of work to get to this point, but actually this is where the work starts. I think you said that to us before, Tony, actually. And, it's from now we want to be having those conversations with different people where we can get nature into the decisions that it needs to be in. We want to understand, how we can bring what is in the report to date to life, how we can make it work for them and how we make it real so that it actually does have impact. That's what we want.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And Mel?
Just going back to that connectivity. So the upstream thinking, Tony, that you talked about, of South West Water farmers doing different things, has actually impacted on water quality down in the coastal margins and in the estuaries. And we're seeing biodiversity change as a consequence. We're fairly sure it's as a consequence of that upstream thinking in the coastal areas. Now, I was trying to explain that to a farmer, and he said, wow, if only I'd known that kind of stuff could happen. So that long-term investment, it is about storytelling. It's about, as you say, being in the room with the people, whether it be, and I do sort of think, I can see a lot of people from different parts of DEFRA ALBs. I'm not quite sure who else is in the room. But all of those people talk to people from, MCLA, I can never remember all the acronyms, communities and housing, DESNES, Treasury, all people in here talk to all people or have different conversations. And it's about having that narrative, picking something out of a report and going, actually, this kind of, affects you. And I think that's also going to help to bring the report to life in different areas, exactly as you've already said.
And I think the great thing about that, Mel, as well, isn't it? It's we're having conversations over the course of time that I've been working in this area. I've got lots of economists who are friends now. I know. I mean, the fact that I've got friends, but I have got lots of economists who are friends, social scientists who are friends, people from across different sectors as well. So it has been brilliant, as you look backwards and see that change. But we've still got a long way to kind of go to get us to the actions being integrated, but, more of the conversations. And I think that's where storytelling and narrative helps us alongside some hard data as well. We kind of need both. And, we really hope that this report provides, some of the hard data, but also some of the stories that we can say, and, this is what it means. So what? So what does it mean? What can you do about it? So I'm on my last question now. So I might actually, if anybody else has got a burning question, they can put their hand up. It says, do we need a cabinet minister for natural capital? What do we think? Can I apply for the job? No. Any thoughts from the panel?
So this is about the discussion around integration, isn't it? To an extent, which bit of government could best coordinate across all of this? Would it be the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, where we're located, or would it be somewhere else? I remember years ago, between this point and those green ministers being announced back in 1990, there was a discussion about having some kind of sustainable development unit in the Cabinet Office, which would have sight across all of government to ensure that we had joined up policies so that health, transport, energy, as well as environment, were thinking about all of these things. So I think that would be my suggestion is maybe not so much, there could be a minister for natural capital, but sitting in a bit of government that's got a view across the whole piece rather than being in one of the departmental silos. I think that would be the key for it being successful. Actually, maybe the natural capital minister would be reporting to the Chancellor and sitting in the Treasury.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the place to do it.
I think, Mel's going to come in a sec, but I think, I'd actually really love to sit in Treasury because it is highly relevant to the Treasury. And in the same way, they might get a report on the Office for Budgetary Responsibility of what's going on there. They would also get a report on the state of natural capital and the implications that has, across their financial decisions and departmental funding. So, I think that would be, that's my weird dream in my life to get to that point. But, I think, that would highly relevant. And of course, Treasury did commission the Disruptor Review, the economics of biodiversity. So they did recognise the relevance there. And I think, it's just another bit of the journey that, they could take. Mel?
So I was very privileged to be on the Natural Capital Committee for 3 years. And I remember one of the things Dieter Helm was proudest about was that this was part of Treasury. It was within Treasury. So, whether we can still look back and say, did Treasury take enough notice of either the Natural Capital Committee or the Dasgupta Review, we can probably discuss to our heart's content. But I think having, as you say, in Treasury is good and trying to keep that presence there. And I'll just give one other example that I was talking to Tony about the other day. In a Southeast Asian country, a very progressive one, Singapore, they have a Minister for Health and Nature who sits across 2 different departments. And I just wonder if there was any wonderful way that we could actually set up more of that kind of thinking where nature is teamed up with some other department. That would be awesome.
Yeah, Rachel.
Just building on that, they're already starting to do that in the sense there's a minister for trade and or for business and energy, Sarah Jones, who sits, so she's not responsible for nature, but that's a trial in having a minister that sits across 2 different departments. So this government is already thinking like that. I would also point out we've got a minister for Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs who does sit at the cabinet table and should be owning this conversation. I think he really is as well, to a large degree. So let's make the best use of what we've got already.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. Thanks, Rachel. Well, I mean, I haven't got any further questions unless there's any from the audience. Oh, I've got a couple. Oh, great. Okay, let's start with Ruth here at the front. Ruth, let me give you a microphone. This is freestyle now. The tech guys at the back are going mad.
This isn't a question. This isn't a question, but just saying. We're talking about integration, and I think that really is the difficult part: systems thinking and integration, even within organisations that have environment in their title. But maybe the first step is about getting an environment envoy associated with every single government mission. If those who are in the power could make those suggestions, so that that's the first step to showing that we can integrate policy delivery.
Yeah, we'll take them all. I've got a wonderful assistant who's freestyling behind, so thank you. Thanks, Harry. The gentleman there, and then Gemma. We'll take all the questions, and then we'll try and answer them.
Thank you. Andrew Clark, National Farmers Union. The report makes a very strong case for investment. And at the end of this month, we're going to be hearing the Chancellor making very clear signs about investment. What should be the message to the Chancellor, especially from Natural England, in respect to this? Because I think we've heard from Rachel that there is some hesitancy for business being able to fill the gap. And yet we're surviving on a budget which was set back in 2005. And yet the case you make here shows that investment would be incredibly good value. I mean, you'd be colourblind not to see it.
Thanks, Andrew. And then last one from Gemma, and then I'll let the panel respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma Harper, Chief Executive, Joint Nature Conservation Committee. Huge congratulations to the Natural England team. This is a really important contribution to knowledge and an important contribution to the way in which we frame the nature debate. I have two questions, if I may, Ruth. The first, Rachel, I loved what you said about natural systems being critical infrastructure. I think that's the framing of this debate that's going to be most significant. I wondered if you'd heard about a company called Faith in Nature who's put nature on the board, and what you think about that initiative and whether it has legs, so to speak. And then secondly, for anybody who would like to answer, it's really interesting and important to hear social justice, inequality being addressed, just transition. It is Black History Month this month, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't comment on the fact that the racial profile in this room is particularly homogenous. So I'm asking, what does that say about how far we've come in some ways, gender, for example, but how far we have to go in terms of ethnicity? Thank you.
Thanks, Gemma. Okay, so who'd like to very quickly, we don't have much time left after we've got some absolute corking questions there, have a go at any of those ones. Tony?
Just on the budget side, there hopefully will be a reflection across the piece about the need to join up economic growth with the growth of nature, and obviously one big area of that, Andrew, is going to be the farm budget, and hoping that we can see the investments in nature's recovery via that route and getting the best possible outcomes that we can from that. We'll see later this month. On the diversity side, I mean, it's just so essential and so core to this whole project of sustainability for all sorts of different reasons, some of which we've touched on today, and how we're going to achieve that greater participation in this discussion. It's a really tough question, and we're struggling with it, frankly. We're struggling with it at Natural England. We're struggling with it as a sector, and making progress as a country in terms of representation of different groups in political process, for example. I think Parliament now, for the first time ever, is more or less broadly representative of the racial profile of the country. But in this sector, it's really hard, and we're spending quite a lot of time thinking about it at Natural England, but yet to make the breakthroughs. But it's very big on our radar screen of something that we need to deal with. And there was a question, wasn't there, about, we will speak to them.
Rachel, did you have anything specifically on the question? And then I'm going to have to tie us up.
I think the point about boardroom representation is really important. I've come across Faith in Nature. It's a fantastic initiative. It all comes down to whether companies feel that this issue really bites for them. I think most large companies now have sort of ESG, somebody with responsibility for ESG sitting on their board. And that person needs to be able to understand the nature issues in a really granular way. So they will bring those conversations to the boardroom table when they can understand the financial implications, when they can understand the business implications properly, and it's not just sort of flag waving and saying, here's a big risk down the line. So I think it will happen as this conversation continues and as there's more clarity about what it really means.
Thank you. And so we've run out of time. I've got people waving madly at me at the front here, but I'd like to say an absolute massive thank you to the panel today. It was very wide-ranging and some real brilliant questions from everybody in the room and online. So thank you very much to all the panel. And that was really great.
Thank you.
Thank you all. That was an absolutely amazing discussion. There's so much to take away from just that discussion, let alone the rest of the day. I am going to try, though, and synthesize some key messages and a bit of reflection. It's only been 2 hours, believe it or not, but it has been an absolutely crammed 2 hours with some really important points. I'm also aware that I'm standing now between yourselves, lunch and further discussion, so I will not go on for too long. But I'll just give some thoughts and highlight some key points. So Tony gave us some really stark messages. He underlined the need for nature to grow, for health, wealth and security, and that has come through the rest of the day. And he also described the tragic fate of nature in our green and present land and also our bountiful blue seas. He also underlined the disproportionate impact on society, and we've heard more about that just now. We need to be alert to that, and we need to be engaging other parts of society in this discussion. And I think that was a point very well made. Thank you, Gemma. And also, this is the opportunity, and this report has given us the opportunity now to bring these priceless assets that we have out of the shadows so we can protect them and grow. The report's also given us the innovative approach to enable us to do that. Ruth brought more out in terms of the technical background of that innovative report and how it makes the invisible visible, and what actions are required to protect and enhance these vital assets. And she also showed us how we could translate the findings into meaningful actions. Marion then gave us the so what. We need to act now, and why we need to act now. And she brought us some stark messages around our ecosystems being in real peril. They are at breaking point. We are starting to see us get very dangerously close to some tipping points in the ecosystems with which we depend, and are possibly reaching ecosystem collapse in some areas, which we do not want to see. So we need to act quickly. We need to create headroom for nature, and we need to provide nature so it can support society and our economy to grow now and in the future. And through that, she also brought the report into the heart of the 5 government missions. That was very powerful. We know what we need to do. We've got the science and the evidence behind what we need to do. We just now need to move on and do it and engage our finance, civil sector and business and economy into acting as well. So building on that, Rachel then gave us some really useful insight from the Aldersgate Group about how they are integrating nature with their partners, and the role of the report in building on that as well, and particularly for boards to integrate nature at the board level across businesses is so important, and we heard more about that in the panel. But it also provides business opportunity to grow in the long term as well. And through that, James then looped us right back to Dasgupta and why we need to transform our relationships with nature across government, finance, and business and society. And I found really powerful the way you looped us back into the debate around paying now or paying later. There aren't any options now. I think we're running out of options to pay later. So then we had the panel discussion, and there was such a lot of rich information in there. And thank you all for your excellent questions that provoked that discussion. We heard that we need to think about engaging government departments beyond DEFRA, across government, and we need to look and capture the message that was coming through today, that nature at risk puts policy at risk across government departments as well. And then the plethora of strategies and plans that are coming out of the new administration, which is great, not all of them factor in nature. So this report provides us the vehicle to enable those strategies now to factor in nature and natural capital. We also heard about GDP and how that doesn't include nature, and the call to Treasury to include nature in a measure for progress, and that inclusive wealth piece. And Natural England and colleagues can support that, Tony. I think that was a point well made. We also heard about the potential for multifunctional urban green space. That is a really exciting area for us and others, particularly around the green social prescribing. We've had some really promising discussions around that area now, and we look to build on those through this report as well. We then thought about how we need to invest in nature to invest in economic growth. Again, the prescriptions we were hearing about, prescription drugs in water, that's a case where investing now and paying now avoids that higher capital cost and economic cost by having to pay later to clean the water. And then fixing human health. We need to fix that as we fix our natural environment. And businesses are starting to get this movement. The report can galvanise this, and it can bring business into the strategic approach now. We looked at how we've got lots of different actions, both within government and within business. This report almost provides that vehicle, well, it does provide the vehicle to be more strategic about those actions, bring them together, coordinate, and work together more effectively. So I was reflecting as we went through the day and as I was scribbling down these notes, and I was at the Natural NECA panel last month, actually, and we were asked on that panel to provide our thoughts on the just one thing. What's the just one thing that we can do to move this forward? And mine was acting with ambitious urgency. And I think that, again, has come through today. So I would like to leave that ringing in our ears. I think we need to act now. I think we need to act across sectors, and we need to act with impact. And we need to act differently. As a trained scientist, I know that we won't get different results by repeating the same methodology. So we've heard today about how we can do this differently, and the tools there are there to enable us to do that. So, and we need to make that real. So let's do that. And do that together. And I hope the conversations that we have across lunch enable us to build on that a little bit more. So I'd like to thank everyone today, everyone who's been on panels, spoken to us, provided questions, and those online who have also provided questions. And I'd also like to thank the Natural Capital team for producing the report and also enabling today to be as thought-provoking as it had. So if you can quickly stand up, everyone will know who you are, and then everyone can talk to you at lunchtime about how we take the report further. I'll do the clap at the end because I haven't quite finished, but we will clap. I'd like to say goodbye now and thank you to our online viewers.
Nature is under pressure. This puts the things we need from nature at risk. Risks to Nature and White Matters is a new report from Natural England. It's England's first comprehensive State of Natural Capital report. It sets out which benefits from nature are at risk, why they're at risk, and what we can do about it. Nature at risk leaves society and the economy at risk. The risks affect decisions that aren't directly about nature. In this report, we focus on 6 policy areas: economic resilience, water security, food security, net zero, climate adaptation, and health and well-being. The report contains specific recommendations for each policy area, benefit, and ecosystem asset. The State of Natural Capital Report for England is groundbreaking because it brings together best available evidence in one place. It adopts a new method for assessing risk to natural capital. It identifies which assets and benefits are most at risk and what is driving the risk. It informs what we can do about it in terms of restoring ecosystems, reducing pressures, and making natural capital central to decision making. Failure to invest in the protection and restoration of nature significantly increases costs the longer we delay. The State of Natural Capital Report for England 2024 is available to download now.